The trade station Verith 9 floated in the cold dark between two dying stars, a massive ring of silver and metal that hummed with the sounds of 100 different species moving through its long corridors. Nobody had asked humanity to come here. Humanity had been invited, which was a very different thing, and that difference mattered to everyone on board. Lena Vasquez stood at the wide observation window and pressed her fingers against the glass. She was 19 years old, short and dark-haired, with ink stains on her jacket from the field notes she never stopped writing, and she stared out at the stars with the kind of wonder that most people lose somewhere between childhood and adulthood. She had not lost it yet. She was the youngest human ever granted observer status at a Galactic Council summit, a fact her mother had cried about for a full hour before hugging her hard and telling her to eat properly and not trust anything with more than 4 eyes. Commander Aldrich Voss stood beside her, tall, grey at the temples, with the careful posture of a man who had spent 30 years learning how to be invisible in rooms full of important people. "You should get some sleep before the morning session," he said to her. "I am not tired," Lena told him. She was never tired when there were new things to look at. Voss did not argue. He had known her for 2 years and he understood that arguing with Lena Vasquez about sleep was the same as arguing with gravity about falling. The summit had been running for 3 days. Hundreds of alien delegates from across the Galactic Council's vast territory had gathered on Verith 9 to discuss trade routes, territorial agreements, and the ever-growing list of species that the Council considered problems to be managed rather than peoples to be respected. Humanity was on that list. Not officially. Officially, humans were classified as observed newcomers, which sounded polite enough, but Lena had watched the way the senior council delegates looked at the human escort team over those 3 days, the slight curl at the edge of certain mouths, the way conversations stopped when humans walked past, the way eyes moved away just a moment too quickly, and she understood what observed newcomers actually meant. It meant, "You are here because we want to study you, not because we consider you our equal." Lena did not let this stop her, or rather, she let it bother her somewhere private and quiet inside herself and then stepped past it, because she had not traveled this far to be stopped by the way strangers looked at her. She had come here to meet people. And she had met Serveth on the very first morning, a soft-spoken delegate from a small species called the Vahari, who had 7 fingers on each hand and a habit of tilting their heads sideways when they were thinking. Serveth had been standing alone near the food corridor, looking at a tray of human fruit with careful and uncertain curiosity. "That one is an orange," Lena had told them. "It is sour but good. You peel the outside and eat what is inside." Serveth had looked at her with enormous dark eyes and said quietly, "You explain things like you are not afraid of anything." "I am afraid of plenty of things," Lena had said. "I am just more curious than I am afraid." They had been friends from that moment. She had also met delegates from 4 other minor species during those 3 days on the station: the Dresh, the Yalani, the Kovadi, and the quiet, long-limbed Sul, all of them peoples that the Galactic Council treated the way powerful groups always treat small ones, with polite condescension and an invisible hand pressing down from above. These were the people Lena kept finding herself beside at meals, in the corridors, in the observation lounges, talking, listening, sharing notes about their home systems. She had never felt more like herself in her life. On the evening of the 3rd day, she was making her way back from the archive wing. She had spent 2 hours carefully copying xenobiology records that the Council had marked as semi-public access, which was slow work but important, when she turned a corner near the junction of 2 main corridors and saw something she was not supposed to see. Ambassador Torixol was standing inside a private communication alcove. The door had not been fully closed. He was tall even by his species standards, grey-plated and cold-eyed, and he was speaking in a low, precise voice to a holographic display showing 3 other senior council figures. Lena stopped walking. She did not mean to listen, but the words reached her through the gap in the door before she could step back. The council had already decided, not in any official chamber, not in any session that the minor species or the human observers had been permitted to attend, but here, quietly. In the dark, they had decided to redraw the galactic boundary maps. A new set of containment corridors would be established within 60 days. Humanity's expansion zone would be reclassified as a formal quarantine sector. Resource access routes would be closed. The justification would be filed under biosecurity protocols to make it sound clean and necessary, and no appeal process would be made available. Lena stood very still in the corridor. She understood, in the space of about 4 seconds, exactly what this meant. Humanity would be boxed in, slowly and legally, with paperwork and bureaucratic language, slowly starved of the resources and space needed to grow, not openly attacked, not destroyed in any way that could be called a war, just quietly and permanently pushed down and kept small. She took one step back. She was not quiet enough. Torixol's head turned. His cold eyes found her face in the corridor, and for one long moment they simply looked at each other across the space between the alcove door and the wall. Then he said something in his own language, very quietly, to the two guards standing at the alcove entrance. Lena ran. She was fast, she had always been fast, but the station was unfamiliar ground and the guards knew its corridors better than she did. She covered 3 full corridor sections before they cut off her route at a junction near the lower freight decks. She had just enough time to pull her communicator free and tap the emergency signal. One single broken burst sent toward Commander Voss's frequency before the first guard reached her. The communicator was pulled from her hand. Torixol walked through the junction doorway about a minute later. He looked at her the way a person looks at a problem that has a straightforward solution. There was nothing in his face that looked like anger or heat or hesitation, only the flat, cold certainty of a man who had made this kind of decision many times before. "This was unfortunate," he said in clean standard tongue. "You should not have been in that corridor." Lena looked at him steadily and said, "People are going to find out what you are doing." He did not respond to that. He gave a small and quiet nod to the guards and turned and walked back through the junction doorway without looking at her again. Commander Aldrich Voss was in the human delegation's quarters when the signal came through. One single broken burst, half a second long, the kind of signal that only ever meant one thing. He was on his feet before the sound had fully stopped. He called her communicator. No answer. He called the station's general security channel. He was told by a flat and polite voice that no incidents had been logged in the past hour. He ran. He searched for 4 hours with the full escort team, every corridor they could access, every public area, every logged route between the archive wing and the delegation quarters, and found nothing. No trace of Lena, no station security records from that section of corridor, no sign of any disturbance, no witnesses who would admit to having seen anything. The Council's official communication arrived at the human delegation quarters at 0300 station time, clean and brief and formal in the way that only carefully prepared documents are. It stated that the human observer Lena Vasquez had suffered a tragic accident in the lower freight sections of the station. The Council expressed its sincere condolences. The incident had been logged with the appropriate authorities. Her personal effects would be returned to her family in due course. Voss read the message once, then he sat down at the edge of the nearest chair, then he read the message again, then he placed the datapad face down on the table and did not move for a very long time. Outside the station's wide windows, the stars continued to burn, cold and indifferent and very, very far from home. The message reached Earth at 0612 Geneva Standard Time, a tight beam transmission compressed into a civilian data packet, routed through 17 relay stations and 3 independent carrier networks to avoid Council interception, and it arrived in the secure inbox of Director Yusuf Okafor as a completely ordinary-looking file transfer flagged as agricultural survey data. It was not agricultural survey data. It was a full recording, audio, visual, and biosignature data of everything that had happened in that corridor on Verith 9, and it had been sent by a Vahari delegate named Veth, who had been returning from the same archive wing that evening and had seen everything from a secondary corridor junction just far enough back to stay out of the guard sight, and who had recorded it on a personal device that the Council's security sweep had not detected because it was not a device in the mechanical sense. It was biological. Woven into Veth's own nervous tissue the way Vahari stored critical memories, activated under extreme emotional stress. Director Okafor watched the recording twice in full silence. Then he called Admiral Mara Chen. Chen arrived at the Terran Command building in Geneva 40 minutes later. She was not a tall woman and she did not look like the most dangerous person in any room she entered, which was one of the reasons she was so effective. She had short grey-streaked hair and a face that gave almost nothing away, and she moved through the building with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who had already decided what needed to happen and was simply moving toward it. Okafor played her the recording without saying anything first. Chen watched it through without speaking. When it finished, she was still for a moment. Then she said, simply, "Where is Commander Voss right now?" "Still on the station," Okafor said. "The Council has not permitted the delegation to depart. They cited standard post-incident review protocols as the reason for the delay. They are keeping him there so they can watch him," Chen said. "So he cannot brief anyone directly before they control the narrative." "Yes. Get him and his team out. Use the freight corridor route through Dresh sector. The Council does not monitor Dresh commercial traffic closely enough to catch it in time." "Already in motion," Okafor said. Chen nodded once, then she sat down at the briefing table and opened Lena Vasquez's personnel file on the central display. She read through it slowly and carefully, the way she read everything that mattered: the academic record, the field certifications, the letters of recommendation from 3 different senior professors who had each used words like exceptional and irreplaceable and the kind of student you meet once in a career. She closed the file. She put her hand flat on the table and looked at the far wall for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Activate Shepard." The room went quiet in a specific and particular way. The 3 staff officers present all stopped what they were doing and turned to look at her. Shepard was not a protocol any of them had genuinely expected to hear called in their lifetimes. It was the kind of plan that existed because serious people had understood, 40 years ago, that humanity's expansion into the galaxy would eventually produce exactly this kind of moment. It had been built quietly and maintained carefully across 4 decades, updated through 3 major revisions, never spoken about outside the rooms where it needed to be spoken about. "Admiral," one of the staff officers said carefully, "Shepard is a full-spectrum operation. Once the first phase is initiated, it cannot be recalled." "I know what it is," Chen said. "I helped write the 3rd revision." Nobody said anything else. Okafor pulled up the activation interface. He looked at Chen one final time. She gave him a small and steady nod. He entered the confirmation sequence. Across human-controlled space, from the inner colony systems to the furthest monitoring outposts near Council territory, something began to happen, and it was not loud or dramatic or visible in any conventional sense. It was, in fact, the opposite. It was a silence. One by one, across thousands of frequencies and sensor bands, human vessels began switching off their transponders. Their engine signatures were masked using shielding technology that had been developed quietly over 15 years and never demonstrated publicly. Their presence on any council-accessible sensor grid simply vanished. Thousands of ships. Gone. Not destroyed, not retreated, not scattered, simply invisible. On council sensor stations positioned along the border sectors, operators began to notice the absence. At first the readings looked like a technical malfunction, the kind that could be explained and corrected. Then the malfunction reports began multiplying across every station simultaneously. Then the operators began to understand that what they were looking at was not a system error. In the Council's primary border command center, an admiral named Verithkor stood in front of a sensor display that had, 22 minutes ago, shown 412 human vessels operating in adjacent space, and that now showed nothing, not reduced numbers, not scattered signals, nothing, a clean and total absence, and he felt something that his species did not experience with any regularity. He felt afraid. He sent an urgent priority message to the High Tribunal immediately. The message said, "The humans are not grieving, they are not protesting, they have filed no diplomatic challenge through any official channel. Their entire fleet presence has disappeared from all sensor coverage simultaneously. I do not know where they are. I do not know what they are doing. I must inform the tribunal that I believe these 2 facts are not separate problems." The message took 11 hours to reach Turexel. Turexel read it at his desk. Then he read the official council communication that had been sent to the human delegation, the one he had personally reviewed and approved. Tragic accident, clean and final and quiet, the way these situations were always handled, the way they had always worked. He sat for a long time with both documents in front of him. Meanwhile, on Earth, in a small and comfortable house on the outskirts of Buenos Aires, a woman named Elena Vasquez answered her door at mid-morning to find 2 uniformed Terran command officers standing on the step. She looked at their faces and she understood immediately, the way mothers always understand. She did not cry in front of them. She thanked them for coming in person rather than sending a transmission. She closed the door quietly. She went to the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea and sat at the table holding it without drinking it for a very long time. On the refrigerator behind her was a photograph held up by a small magnet. Lena at 16, standing in front of a telescope array in the mountains of Chile, her grin wide enough to fill the whole frame, looking exactly like someone who had just been handed the entire universe as a personal gift. Elena looked at the photograph for a while. Then she set down the tea, pulled on her garden gloves, and went outside. The tomatoes needed checking and they would not check themselves. Life continued even when it felt like it absolutely should not, because that is what life does, and she knew her daughter would have agreed with her about that. Back in Geneva, Admiral Chen was reviewing the first confirmed phase reports when Okafor set a secondary communication on the table in front of her. It had arrived from Miss Erveth, who was at that moment hiding in a maintenance corridor on Verith 9 while Council security ran sweeps through the station's public sections. The message was short. It said, "I am sorry I could not stop it. I am sorry I could only record it. I am sending you everything I have. Please tell me that it matters." Chen wrote back personally. She kept it to 4 words. "It matters. Come home." The second phase of Shepherd began at midnight Geneva time, and the galaxy, which had mistaken humanity's silence for grief, was about to discover what it actually was. The first thing that happened was a broadcast. It went out on every public frequency the Galactic Council used, every trade channel, every news relay, every diplomatic band, simultaneously across all 12 major council sectors, and it began not with a declaration of war, not with a demand for justice, not with any kind of threat. It began with a simple label that appeared on every screen, in every language across council territory. The label said, "What the council did to your people." The files that followed were not new. They had existed for decades, locked inside council archive systems that were supposed to be impenetrable. But human intelligence teams had been moving carefully through those systems for years, patient and quiet and invisible, copying documents and cataloging records and waiting for the moment when they would be needed. And now every single file was public, open, and running on every frequency that reached every corner of council space. Species that had been told their home systems were destroyed by natural disasters watched recordings of council engineering teams deliberately destabilizing planetary cores. Species that had been told their populations had declined due to illness saw the resource denial programs that had manufactured those declines. Trade agreements that had been presented to smaller civilizations as generous and fair were shown in full, with the internal council memos attached that explained in plain language exactly how each agreement had been designed to keep smaller peoples permanently dependent and permanently controllable. The broadcast ran for 6 straight hours without interruption. In the council's capital system, the High Tribunal chamber became loud in a way it had not been in living memory. Delegates shouted over each other, pointed fingers across the table, demanded that the frequencies be identified and shut down immediately. But the broadcast was not being sent from any single location that could be found and blocked. It was distributed across thousands of relay points scattered across the galaxy, many of them positioned inside council space itself, placed there years ago by people who had understood with great clarity that this day might eventually arrive. The second thing that happened was quieter, and in many ways more unsettling. 3 of the Galactic Council's primary logistics relay stations, vast orbital platforms that coordinated the movement of supplies, fuel, weapons, and materials across a full quarter of council territory, went offline at exactly the same moment, not destroyed, not attacked, not damaged in any way that showed up on a weapon scan, simply switched off. Every system, every function, every backup, powered down in perfect and total silence. The stations had been constructed with redundant security protocols across 40 layers of encryption, layers that the Council's own engineers had spent decades refining, and every single one of those layers had been bypassed using access codes that a human engineering team had quietly embedded inside the systems 13 years ago, during a brief diplomatic exchange period when they had been contracted for what the Council's records described as routine infrastructure maintenance. The Council had not audited those systems since. The human engineers had been, in Okafor's words later, extremely thorough. Supply chains across a quarter of the galaxy ground to a stop. Council military logistics officers began receiving cascading failure reports across every screen on every station. Food shipments, medical supplies, manufactured components, fuel reserves, all of it sitting still and dark and unmoving in space, going nowhere. Council commanders began making calls to the tribunal that sounded less like reports and more like requests for someone to tell them that this was not what it appeared to be. Nobody could tell them that. But the third thing was the thing that the galaxy would talk about for a very long time afterward. A single human warship decloaked inside the home system of Torixol's people, the Galvra system, the most heavily fortified location in all of Council space, ringed by 42 active defense platforms, protected by 2 full battle fleets in permanent rotating patrol, and monitored by a sensor network that had never once in its history failed to detect an incoming vessel. The ship was a mid-sized cruiser, not enormous, not a flagship, not anything that announced itself as the most powerful weapon humanity had ever fielded. It was simply there, when nothing should have been able to be, sitting completely still in high orbit above the Galvary homeworld with its running lights on and its weapons cold and its shields lowered. The 2 Council battle fleets scrambled within minutes. Alert klaxons ran across every platform in the system. Within 8 minutes, the human cruiser was completely surrounded, weapons locked from every direction, enough combined firepower aimed at it to reduce it to scattered gas in under a second. The cruiser did not move. It did not charge weapons or raise shields or attempt to flee or broadcast any threatening communication. It sat in that orbit with the calm and unhurried stillness of something that had decided it was not in danger. It transmitted one message to the Council Fleet Commander: clean standard tongue, level and quiet, no aggression in the delivery. We have been here before. We were present in this system 8 months ago, and 14 months before that, and twice more in the 3 years before that. Each time we came, we observed, and we left, and we told no one. This time we are staying long enough for you to see us, not because we want to fight, but because we want you to understand the difference between what we choose to do and what we are capable of doing. The fleet commander did not give the order to fire. He was not a coward. He was a person with enough intelligence and enough experience to recognize that a species which could enter the most fortified system in the galaxy 5 times over 5 years and depart without detection was not a species that was frightened of his guns. Firing would not make humanity less dangerous. It would only remove the restraint they had chosen to show. He reported to the tribunal in full, "The vessel is not attacking, and I do not believe it intends to. I believe it is communicating. I believe we need to listen to what it is saying rather than trying to silence it." In the weeks that followed, 12 minor species formally broke their membership with the Galactic Council, citing the released archive files, citing the evidence that had now been seen by every population in Council territory, citing the fact that a species the Council had categorized as primitive newcomers had apparently been present inside their most secure systems for years without anyone noticing a thing. The Vahari were among the first to announce their departure. The Dresh followed within 48 hours. The Yalani, the Kavadi, and the Sul came shortly after, and when they left, they released their own statements to every public frequency they could reach, statements describing what it had been like to sit in council summits for decades being told their people's fates had been decided for them. Torixol sat in the tribunal chamber and watched the member count on the central display drop, one by one, across the following days. He had never in his long career considered that a single dead human girl could produce this kind of outcome. He had made a calculation, clean and practical, the same kind of calculation the council had been making for centuries. The kind that treated individual lives as acceptable costs when weighed against the interests of the powerful. He was beginning to understand, in a way he had never been required to understand before, that humans did not make that calculation about their own people. Not about any of them. Not ever, regardless of how young or small or politically inconvenient that person might have been. One elder council delegate, watching the member board continue to fall, leaned across to the delegate beside her and said what a growing number of people in that chamber were privately thinking. They have not even deployed a full fleet yet. This is only the warning, the actual warning, and it is already doing this to us. Nobody in the room had a good answer for that. Because there was not one. Commander Aldrich Voss did not sleep much during the weeks after Verith 9, not because he was unable to, but because every time he closed his eyes he saw the same thing, an observation window and a 19-year-old girl pressing her fingers against the glass, looking out at the stars like they were a personal gift that had been handed to her specifically. He had gotten off the station 3 days after it happened, through a freight corridor that smelled like Dresh engine oil and old recycled air, moving fast and low with the rest of the escort team, saying nothing until they were on a human vessel with the airlock sealed behind them, and then he had sat down on the floor of the corridor outside the bridge with his back against the wall and stayed there for a while. He did not stay there long. Voss was not a man who gave himself extended time to fall apart, not because he was hard but because he understood that falling apart was something you had to earn by finishing the work first. He got up, and he got to work. The 2 council enforcers who had taken Lena were not, in the end, as difficult to find as they had assumed they would be. They had made the mistake of believing that because the event had been erased from Verith 9's official records, it had been erased from existence entirely. They had not accounted for the fact that Esservetha's biological recording existed, and they had not accounted for the fact that Commander Aldrich Voss had spent 30 years building something that could not be erased from any record. He tracked them through movement logs, through financial transfer records, through a network of contacts assembled over 3 decades of diplomatic escort work across a dozen different species territories, aliens who owed him favors, who respected him, who remembered that he was one of the very few humans they had ever encountered who treated minor species with genuine and consistent courtesy, rather than the practiced tolerance that powerful people used as a substitute for respect. It took him 6 weeks, 2 false starts, and 1 very cold night on a Galvary border colony that he would not talk about later. He found the first enforcer on a council resupplied depot in the outer sectors, working a routine logistics posting as though nothing had happened. He found the second at a private residential block 3 systems away. He did not approach either of them with a weapon, or with a military team, or with anything that could be described as a threat. He approached them with documentation, every piece of evidence Esserveth had recorded, carefully cross-referenced against backup node data that Terran intelligence had recovered from secondary systems that the Council's cleanup team had not known existed. He brought both enforcers to the newly formed Interspecies Justice Commission, a body that had appeared in the weeks following the Shepherd broadcasts, built almost organically by the minor species who had broken from the council and who had decided together that if a new order was genuinely coming, then justice needed to be built into its foundation from the start rather than added later as an afterthought. He delivered both individuals alive, unharmed, and accompanied by enough documented evidence to make any defense functionally impossible. People who heard about this later sometimes asked him why he had not done something else, something less careful and more immediate, given what they had done to Lena. He answered the same way every time, in the same patient and quiet voice, because she would have wanted it done right. On Earth, in the small house outside Buenos Aires, Elena Vasquez moved through her days with a steadiness that people around her found equal parts remarkable and heartbreaking. She went to the market on Thursday mornings, tended her garden in the afternoons, sat on the back step in the evenings with her tea and watched the light change. She answered the letters that arrived, first from across Earth and then, slowly and steadily, from across the galaxy, because the story of what had happened to Lena had traveled to places Lena had never been, and something in that story had reached people who needed to respond to it. She answered every letter personally. She was not a public figure and had no interest in becoming one, but she understood that Lena had been trying to build something during those 3 days on Verith 9, something made of conversations and orange fruit and genuine curiosity about strangers who turned out to be people, and the least she could do was keep building it in the small and practical way available to her. She wrote back to a Dresch family who had named their new daughter after a human word for light. She wrote back to a Corvadi elder who said that a human girl had been the first outsider to ever ask about their oral history traditions with real interest. She wrote back to a Yolani biologist who had read Lena's published field notes and wanted to discuss a shared observation about deep atmosphere organisms in gas giant systems. She answered them all, with the same steadiness she put into everything, because that is what you do, and because Lena would have done the same. Serveth arrived at a human station in the outer colonies 8 weeks after Verith 9. They came with nothing except the clothes they wore and the recording device woven into their nervous tissue and a formal request for asylum. The asylum was granted within 1 hour of their arrival, which was the fastest processing time in the station's recorded history. A young crew member named Torres was assigned to help them settle into the station's civilian quarters. He was 22 years old and had never met a Vahari in person before and was visibly working very hard not to stare at the 7-fingered hands. Serveth found this effort more endearing than the staring would have been. On their 3rd day aboard the station, they sat together in the small common room off the main corridor, both of them with cups of tea between their hands, Serveth having decided on the 2nd day that tea was acceptable and possibly quite good. And Serveth asked the question that had been sitting at the back of their mind since the first Shepherd broadcasts began running on every frequency. Why did you not declare war? They said. You had proof, you had capability, you had public support from every minor species in Council territory. You could have removed the Council entirely within weeks and no one in the galaxy would have blamed you for it. Torres thought about this for a while. He was not a philosopher or a military strategist, just a crew member who repaired navigation systems and occasionally burned his meals in the communal kitchen. But he took the question seriously because it deserved to be taken seriously. I think, he said slowly, it is because a war ends. You fight it and it finishes and the next powerful group that rises up eventually does the same thing all over again. Because the lesson a war teaches is only about power, but a warning, a real one, where you show exactly what you could do and then choose not to do it. That teaches a different lesson. It teaches that the most dangerous thing in the room decided to hold back, and that it could change its mind, and it hasn't yet. People think about that for a very long time. They think about it before they do anything that might change your decision. Serveth tilted their head to one side, the thinking gesture that Lena had found charming enough to mention 3 separate times in her field notes. Lena said something like that to me. They said, different words, first morning. When I asked her why she came to a summit full of people who did not want her there, she said she was more curious than afraid. That is it exactly, Torres said. That is the whole thing, right there. Serveth looked at their tea for a moment. Then they said, very quietly, she was trying to make friends when they killed her. Yes, Torres said. And now the galaxy is different because of it. Yes. Serveth was quiet for a while after that, long enough that the station's corridor sounds became audible again, the ordinary hum of machinery and distant voices and the small comfortable noises of a place where people lived and worked together. Then they said, I hope she would have been glad of that. Torres thought about the one photograph he had seen. In a briefing document he was not supposed to have read all the way through. A 16-year-old girl in front of a telescope array, grinning with her whole face, looking like someone who had just realized the universe was bigger than she had known and found this to be the best news she had ever received. "I think she would have been," he said. "I think that would have been exactly enough for her." The Galactic Council requested negotiations on a Tuesday. The message was formal and carefully worded and used the phrase mutual benefit for separate times and the phrase regrettable incident twice. Admiral Chen read it at her desk in Geneva in the early morning while her coffee went cold beside her, then read it again. Then set it aside and looked at the ceiling for a long quiet moment. Then she wrote a response. It was not long. It said, "Before any negotiations begin, the Council will broadcast on all public frequencies, in every language in its territory, the full name, complete history, and accurate account of what happened to the human observer who died on Verith 9. This is not a precondition open to discussion or modification. It is a precondition." The Council's response arrived within 6 hours. They called her requirement unusual and without diplomatic precedent and emotionally motivated rather than strategically sound. Chen sent back one line, "You have 48 hours. The broadcast went out at hour 47. It was not a comfortable broadcast for the tribunal to produce. The council spokesperson read through it in the flat and uninflected tone of someone performing a task they found deeply unpleasant, but every word was present, on every public frequency, in every registered language that the council's territory contained. Lena Vasquez, 19 years old, xenobiologist apprentice, Buenos Aires, Earth. What she had witnessed in that corridor, what had been ordered, what had been done, and why. The council had then described it as an accident. 47 worlds heard her name for the first time that day. Elena Vasquez heard the broadcast in her kitchen. She had been told by Terran Command that it was coming and had decided she wanted to listen to it rather than read the transcript afterward. She stood at her counter with her hands wrapped around her mug and listened to a council spokesperson say her daughter's name on a signal that reached 1,000 worlds and 100 different species. When it finished, she set the mug down and pressed her knuckles briefly against her mouth. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the morning's letters. The negotiation itself was held on Verith 9, humanity's choice, deliberate and pointed and communicated without explanation because no explanation was necessary. The station where it had happened, made. Into the place where it would be answered. Chen led the human delegation personally. She arrived without ceremony or theatrical display, without anything that looked like a victory march. She arrived with a small and quiet team, clean documentation, and a clear agenda, and she ran the 9 days of talks with the same steady and unhurried precision she brought to everything. Torixol was present at the table. His own government had not yet decided formally how to handle him, and the Interspecies Justice Commission's case was still being prepared. So he sat at the far end of the negotiation room looking like a man who had recently been introduced to the concept of consequences for the first time in his long career. He did not say much during the 9 days. What emerged from those 9 days was not a peace treaty, or rather, it was more than one and larger than any single document. It was a complete restructuring of the Galactic Council's authority from the Foundation upward. The High Tribunal's power to act unilaterally in matters affecting other species was formally dissolved. A new multi-species charter was signed that guaranteed a permanent and equal seat on all major decisions for every recognized civilization regardless of size, age, military strength, or resource level. An independent interspecies justice commission was formally established with real enforcement authority and multi-species oversight. The quarantine boundary plan was cancelled in full and its complete documentation released publicly alongside the rest of the Council's hidden records. Several Council species initially refused to sign the new charter. Their representatives sat with crossed arms and the particular expression of people who had been told they no longer got to make decisions the way they used to. They were reminded, politely and only once, that the human cruiser was still in orbit above the Galvary homeworld and had not yet received any instruction to leave. They signed before the end of the same day. On the final evening of the negotiations, after the formal sessions were finished and the delegations were beginning to pack their things and say their quiet goodbyes, Torixol crossed the room toward Admiral Chen. It was not something anyone expected, and the movement silenced the room immediately. He stopped on the far side of the table from her and stood there, and he was not the same thing he had been on Verith 9 3 months ago. The cold certainty was gone, replaced by something that looked like a man who had been turned around to face. Something he had spent his entire life keeping behind him. "I want to understand one thing," he said, in a voice that had lost most of its former precision. "You had every justification, the evidence, the public support, the capability. You could have destroyed us and the galaxy would have watched and said nothing. Why did you not?" Chen looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Because a girl named Lena Vasquez came here to meet people and learn things and build something real across the distance between species. And if we had burned all of that down in response to what you did to her, we would have destroyed the very thing she came to this station to create. She did not come here to start a war. She came here because she was more curious than afraid. And she wanted to see if that curiosity could make the galaxy a smaller and better place. And the least we could do, the absolute least, was finish what she started. Turexel stood with that for a moment. Then he turned and walked quietly out of the room. The station was officially renamed 3 days later, in a short ceremony attended by representatives of 47 species. The trade station Verith 9 was redesignated as Vasquez Point. The name was entered into the new multi-species charter as a permanent designation and registered in every major galactic navigation system from that day forward. A small plaque was placed at the observation window in the corridor where Voss had last seen Leno live, not at the freight junction where she had been taken, but at the window where she had stood with her. Fingers pressed against the glass and the whole dark universe spread out beyond it. The plaque did not carry a long inscription. It carried her name, her age, and one line beneath both. The line said, "She was more curious than afraid." In the months that followed, the new charter moved slowly and imperfectly through the galaxy the way real change always does. There were arguments and setbacks and moments where the old habits of power seemed like they would win after all, but it kept moving, carried forward by 47 species and then 60 and then more, peoples who had decided together that they were finished being managed by the strong on behalf of the strong. The Vahari became one of the most active voices in the new commission, patient and precise and deeply committed to the principle that individual lives were not acceptable losses, not for any calculation, not for any convenience, not ever. Serveth eventually became the Vahari's first permanent representative on the Charter Council, which was a position that would not have existed under the old order, held by a person who would have had no seat at any table the galaxy's old powers controlled. 9 months after the negotiations ended, the Vahari launched their first independent deep space vessel, built with technology they had developed themselves, without council approval or council oversight, because they no longer required either. They named the ship the Lena Vasquez. At the launch ceremony, Serveth stood in front of the assembled crew and spoke without prepared notes. They talked about a summit on Verith 9 and a human girl who had explained how to peel an orange and said without any self-consciousness that she was more curious than afraid. They talked about what that had cost and what it had built, and then they stopped talking, because the ship was ready and the stars were waiting and Lena Vasquez had not traveled this far just to stand still. The ship left the dock and moved out toward open space. It carried in its databanks a full copy of every field note Lena had ever written, her observations on xenobiology, her careful and enthusiastic records of every new species she had ever encountered, her ink-stained and wonder-filled documentation of a person who had looked at a galaxy full of strangers and seen only friends she had not met yet. Outside the viewports, the stars were cold and ancient and very far away. But the ship moved toward them anyway. Because that is what curiosity does. It moves toward the unknown. And it does not stop. Even after everything. Especially after everything.